There are lots of places in the St. Francis Mountain region of the Missouri Ozarks where bedrock patterns don't follow simple rules.
The oldest bedrock here is a thick sequence of volcanic and other igneous rocks whose original formation we covered in a previous video. But in this video, we're exploring a new question.
I'm standing on ancient Precambrian igneous rock, but below me, down in the stream bed, Joanna is standing on much younger Cambrian sedimentary rock. How do we explain that? The geologic law of superposition says that older rocks should normally be found beneath younger layers.
But in this area, we routinely find older igneous rocks forming the high ground, their summits looking down on valleys underlain by far younger sedimentary rocks.
Were the rocks tilted by tectonic activity? Were they displaced vertically by a fault? We'll explore those possibilities, but spoiler alert, the fundamental answer here is that this is the trace of an ancient buried landscape. For me personally, this is one of the most fascinating topics in all of Ozark geology. The idea that you can stand here in the St. Francis Mountains and look out over a modern landscape that simultaneously reveals a much more ancient landscape, coexisting like parallel universes coming into phase in a science fiction story. So join us here on Ozark Cited in the latest chapter of our Geology of the Ozarks series as we wade into this idea by exploring the unusual bedrock patterns and distinct modern topography of the St. Francis Mountains. You'll never see these hills the same way again.
Elephant Rock State Park is famous for its granite boulders, but the woods along the park's margin hold a different geologic curiosity. On one side of this small valley, we can see exposed Precambrian granite, but over here we can find evidence of much younger Paleozoic sedimentary rock. If superposition tells us that the younger stuff should be on top, we need a better explanation for why they're next to each other instead. One possibility is that the whole sequence has been tilted onto its side by tectonic activity, but that's difficult to check here because the sedimentary bedrock is obscured by soil and trees. Another possibility is that a fault has cut through the sequence right here, elevating the older rocks relative to the younger ones. We found no evidence for this on site, and no fault has been mapped here despite this being a very well-known geologic site. A third possibility is that the original contact between the two rocks wasn't level. There could have been an old hillside eroded into igneous rock over which the younger sedimentary rock was deposited. Let's visit another site that offers a similar mystery, but with better exposures. Here at Johnson Shut-In State Park, the slope in the foreground is Precambrian igneous rock, while the slope in the background and most of the valley floor is much younger Paleozoic sedimentary rock. Seem familiar? Here we can check the tilting hypothesis because there are good bedrock exposures, which clearly show that the sediments are essentially flat-lying. Like the last site, no fault has been mapped here, but here we can actually find the contact between the two rocks down in the creek, which shows no sign of faulting or disturbance. That rules out tilting or faulting, but what about the old hillside idea? It's certainly reasonable to conclude that the flat-lying sedimentary bedrock simply laps up and over the igneous rock in what would be called a depositional contact. But the relationship here is still somewhat obscured, so let's move on to an even better site. This road cut along Highway 72 is a classic location for studying this question. At the base of this exposure is more Precambrian volcanic rock. Directly above this is a sedimentary layer composed of coarse conglomerate, essentially rubble, that appears to be primarily composed of material derived from the solid volcanic rock below. Above the conglomerate is in transition to finer-grained sedimentary rocks. This conglomerate unit is often called the basal conglomerate in this area because it often marks the base of the entire sequence of younger sedimentary rocks that make up most of the Ozarks. This outcrop nicely demonstrates superposition, with the younger rocks on top where they're supposed to be. But if we step back and look across the outcrop, we can see that the upper surface of the Precambrian bedrock is far from flat. So moving laterally across the outcrop, staying at the same level, you can encounter rocks of varying ages. This helps clarify what we saw previously. In all three cases so far, the older igneous and younger sedimentary rocks are separated by the surface of an ancient landscape, what geologists properly call paleotopography, over which the younger sediments were deposited. A broader view provides more evidence of paleotopography. On the south side of the cut, the sediments are at road level, but just across the road, the Precambrian rock towers overhead with no sign of overlying sediments. There's no sign of faulting here either, so the default assumption is that the ancient land surface extends upwards somewhere over our heads. You can see this most clearly in this older photo, from a geologic field guide published while the cut was still fresh. Here it's really obvious how the essentially horizontal sedimentary beds truncate against the ancient igneous hillside, clearly demonstrating how sediments can accumulate on an uneven landscape and eventually overtop local terrain features. That's pretty cool, but let's visit another site that provides even better evidence for sedimentary deposition over uneven paleotopography. This site at the Taum Sauk hydroelectric plant is well known to geologists, but unfortunately it's not accessible to the public, so we're again using imagery from a Missouri Geologic Survey field trip guidebook. The left side of this outcrop shows a now familiar sequence, with Precambrian igneous rocks topped by Paleozoic sedimentary rocks. But these sedimentary layers aren't level. What's the explanation? Are we still looking at paleotopography, or could the bedrock here have been folded or faulted after deposition? A closer look reveals an important clue. It's clear that the sedimentary layers truncate against the igneous rock, rather than lying parallel to the contact, just as we saw at the last outcrop. And if we look at the right side of this outcrop, we see a similar pattern, with the overlying sedimentary layers truncating against the igneous rocks. And here we can see another important piece of evidence for sedimentation. The way that local low spots on the paleotopography appear to be filled in by truncated sediments while the overlying beds continue uninterrupted. This all supports the idea that these sediments accumulated over significant paleotopography, just as we discussed at the last stop. But why aren't they flat-lying here? There's no evidence of faulting, and although you might wonder if there's a big fold here, we can tell you that that's not the answer either. This is a fun little brain teaser. Can you come up with an explanation? There's a solution to this geologic puzzle that's become the common understanding at this site. Sediments tend to be deposited horizontally, but most have a fair amount of water and pore space in them. Over time, as layers get deposited on top, the collective weight begins to compress the underlying sediments. If everything is flat, they'll generally do so evenly, leaving little direct evidence of the compaction. But here, loose, compactable sediments got deposited onto an uneven hillside of dense, uncompactable igneous rock. So, over time, sediments that started out horizontal got squished into rocks that show a considerable local dip. And this is particularly good evidence for sediments being deposited on a landscape with pre-existing paleotopography. But so far, all the sites we've visited have demonstrated just a few tens of feet of local relief. Let's visit a much more dramatic setting. Here I'm on Precambrian volcanic rocks at Missouri's highest point. If I wanted to look for the younger overlying sedimentary rocks, where would I go? I can't go up. So we went down. And at the base of the mountain...
Wow, we found a great outcrop. This is the basal conglomerate.
But it's across the creek, and we need a closer look.
It's February and this water is freezing. Things we do for geology. We've now descended about 700 feet through a thick sequence of volcanic deposits, only to find the first younger sedimentary rock here at the base of the mountain. This conglomerate of boulders and cobbles that grades up into finer sandstone represents the onset of younger sedimentary deposition on an ancient landscape.
Regionally, it's actually pretty common to find 700 feet or more of modern vertical relief separating older igneous summits and the first appearance of younger sedimentary rocks in the valleys. The original valleys must have been at least that deep, and other reports have suggested that regional paleotopographic relief was quite a bit higher. But can we check this for ourselves? Further south, along the current river, isolated igneous summits protrude from the surrounding sedimentary rocks, rising 500 to 700 feet above the river valley. These Precambrian rocks must connect somewhere below, forming an older, deeper valley that was filled in by sediments before modern erosion shaped the landscape we see today. But how deep does that paleotopography go? Well logs, which we discussed in a previous video, let us look further underground. There's a well about here that drills 355 feet below the surface. Let's draw a cross-section from Wildcat Mountain to Peter Mooney Mountain and see what this well can tell us. The igneous rocks on both summits must connect somewhere below the current river, giving us a minimum paleotopographic relief of around 700 feet. But that well starts about here and drills down another 355 feet. Its log records only sedimentary rock all the way down, implying that the total paleotopography beneath the current river here is, at minimum, over 900 feet. So, did that ancient rugged landscape develop through pure erosion, or do we need to revisit the question of faulting? There are lots of faults mapped in this region. Faults tend to be roughly linear, as do the map patterns they create in geologic contacts. But in general, faults in this region don't show much correlation with the broader outcrop pattern of the igneous sedimentary contact. In contrast, the complex curvaceous contacts we do see are far more representative of sediment deposition slowly filling in paleotopography. And this fits our overall theme that the regional contacts between igneous and sedimentary rocks reflect deposition over an eroded, rugged landscape. So in most cases, the local juxtaposition of older and younger rocks in this region isn't directly due to later faulting offsetting all of the bedrock. But some researchers have suggested that tectonic activity did develop a network of faults that altered the landscape while sediments were first being deposited. For example, Buford Mountain, an isolated igneous ridge that falls just short of being Missouri's highest point, sits on a larger block of land bordered by faults. This vertically exaggerated cross-section shows how what's now Buford Mountain stands on the upthrown portion of a fault block, bounded on either side by deep valleys formed by the downthrown blocks, subsequently filled in by sediments. To help make this clear, let's reverse the process. Before the faulting, the ancient landscape did already have topography. But the suggestion here is that fault movement enhanced this during early sediment deposition, not only creating higher peaks and lower valleys, but probably also increasing local erosion along the faults. Fault-derived erosion is also one suggested explanation for the origin of at least some of those basal conglomerates, but we're not going to pursue that further here. This ancient landscape, with its 1,000 feet or so of vertical relief, was eventually entirely buried by sedimentary rocks, before being re-exposed by much later erosion. Modern igneous hillsides don't necessarily preserve the exact paleotopography, since recent erosion has continued to reshape them, but there's clearly an influence on the modern landscape. For example, southwest of today's Buford Mountain is the unusually broad, flat Bellevue Valley, which looks that way because it's a down-dropped fault block filled in by sediments. These originally covered the entire terrain to an uncertain depth, before erosion developed the modern landscape. A broader perspective reveals a very distinct landscape pattern. Regionally, erosion-resistant igneous rocks tend to form protruding rounded shapes, quite different from the more dendritic pattern caused by erosion into the softer, overlying sedimentary rocks. And one particularly fun example of paleotopography influencing the modern landscape is the formation of shut-ins, isolated narrow gorges that develop where modern rivers cutting down through sedimentary rocks briefly encounter the much harder igneous paleotopography. These are one of the neatest features of the St. Francis Mountain region, and we spent a whole separate video exploring their development. When you stand on an igneous mountaintop in the St. Francis region and look out across the modern terrain, you're also looking out over the traces of a deeply eroded, long-buried mountain range. And there are places where a bit of imagination lets you time travel back to that ancient landscape.
But just how much time passed between the original volcanism, the long period of erosion that formed the paleotopography, and the onset of rising Cambrian seas that began to inundate the landscape? That's the subject of the next video in this series. You may have noticed the changing seasons in this video, from the original filming in January and February to the most recent footage recorded 8 months later. These videos take a lot of time, resources, and travel to develop, and as an independent channel, we're very grateful to anyone who can provide financial support through a simple tip. You can click the thanks button below the video, or leave a tip via Ko-fi, where a larger percentage of your support goes to us. If you can't, we totally understand and hope you'll like, comment, subscribe, and spread the word. Thanks for being a part of this journey.